tomorrow at 2, only on Travel Channel.
Washington, D.C., America's proud capital, is home to the biggest museum complex in the world, the renowned Smithsonian Institution. One of the most popular branches of the Smithsonian is the National Museum of American History. With over 3 million artifacts, this museum has the definitive take on the history of the United States. And hidden within its vast collection is what seems at first a puzzling acquisition. A worn and weathered 80-year-old briefcase. But this attaché once belonged to a lifelong politician and diplomat and held countless top-secret and sensitive government documents.
The briefcase we have in our collection once belonged to Adlai Stevenson.
For some 40 years, Stevenson carried this simple briefcase as a governor, a presidential candidate, and the American ambassador to the United Nations.
I would say the briefcase is witness to many moments in time.
But curators at the Smithsonian believe this briefcase was party to a watershed event that changed the history of the planet. 13 critical days when the fate of the free world was at stake.
How would you pull back from the brink? And that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. It was one of those moments where everybody went right to the brink.
The story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is well known, its main players all too familiar. But at the heart of the crisis is a little-known diplomat whose steadfast actions might just have saved the world from nuclear war. And at hand at the crucial moment was this simple briefcase. What did it contain? And how did Stevenson help defuse the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War? October 1962. The world's two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, are locked in a dangerous nuclear arms race.
Both of these superpowers are building these large arsenals of weapons that can destroy the world.
In the U.S., concerns are growing over Soviet ties to a communist nation just off the American coast, Cuba. And the CIA is about to make a shocking discovery that will confirm the nation's worst fears. Early morning, October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane completes a recon flight over the island, taking 928 aerial photographs. The photographs show several nuclear missile bases under construction. From their size and design, it's clear that they are Russian-made. By the time the aerial photos hit President Kennedy's desk, the terrifying implications are clear.
These bases could launch short-range and mid-range missiles that could attack virtually every city in the United States.
Cuba is just 90 miles from the U.S. Millions of Americans could be just hours away from a nuclear attack. After 5 tense days of around-the-clock deliberations, Kennedy calls for a naval blockade of the island to prevent Russian ships from arriving with more nuclear supplies. When Kennedy announces the blockade on national television, shockwaves reverberate around the world.
Once that information comes out, there's this panic.
The Soviets deny the existence of the weapons and regard the blockade as an act of war.
The Soviets had no idea that the Americans actually had tangible evidence of the missiles.
American destroyers move into position, but the Soviet supply ships steam ahead.
We were really at the brink of war between the two superpowers.
In a last-ditch effort, the United Nations steps in and demands an emergency session. And a new player enters the fray, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson. October 25th, Stevenson arrives at the UN in New York. He carries with him his briefcase, a trusted companion which has held countless documents throughout his long career. Now, it carries the notes and papers Stevenson will use in the most critical presentation of his life. Stevenson prepares to show the world irrefutable evidence that the Soviets are building missile silos on the island of Cuba. This will be the definitive diplomatic showdown of the crisis. Finally, Stevenson confronts his counterpart, the Soviet ambassador, Valerian Zorin.
Stevenson at that moment turns to him and says, I have a simple question to ask you. Does the Soviet Union have missiles in Cuba? That's yes or no. He's clearly commanding the room, and he's giving a great performance.
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
When he's demanding an answer, it's something that he knows, and everyone knows. The whole world is watching.
With the attention of the world focused on him, Stevenson unveils the aerial photographs that prove the missiles exist. The world awaits the Russian response with bated breath.
And it's those aerial photographs that become the evidence that changes the dynamic of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they realize that now is the time to start to step back from this crisis and find a negotiated way out.
The next day, on October 26th, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev relays a message to Kennedy. The Soviet Union will remove the missiles from Cuba, provided the U.S. agrees not to invade the island nation. And at the heart of the crisis was Adlai Stevenson, a man who stood up to fight for peace in front of the entire world.
That moment where he becomes the voice of the nation for that brief moment is something that he'll always be remembered for.
This briefcase at the National Museum of American History represents the pinnacle of one man's career and a diplomatic victory won under the most perilous circumstances. Axes and attaches, protest flags and polar planes, mysterious bombs, and haunted busts, each with its own secret history waiting to be discovered. These are the mysteries at the museum.